Tier 1 Self-Contained 4 to 6 Math, Inclusive Student Activities, Part 1. Hopefully you've seen this definition before. We've shared it in other professional development sessions, and it comes from our math instructional guide. It grounds us in what it is that we are striving to achieve with our students as we provide them with the best education we can. The mathematics classroom should be a space that centers students and fosters joy and curiosity. We are moving away from the gradual release model, I do, we do, you do, as the standard form of instruction, and instead moving toward a model that leverages student thinking and assets. It is critical for all learners to engage in sense-making, discuss their ideas with their peers, and make connections before and while engaging in guided instruction. Therefore, mathematics instruction must be reorganized from teaching how to solve problems to teaching math through problem solving. And I want to note that when we say all learners, we mean every single child in our classroom. To me, this definition reminds me that learning is an active process. I learn by doing. I learn by struggling and making mistakes. I learn by collaborating. Inclusive student activities is where we're able to really differentiate for all learners, but we want to keep this in mind because we want to make sure we are still giving students opportunities to sense make, not just to blindly practice problems over and over, that we're giving students opportunities to talk and collaborate, not just to sit silently, and that we're making connections for them throughout the math block. So, our 3 goals for today. First, we want to make connections to previous learning around the math instructional guide in order to jog our memories and situate ISA within the 90-minute math block. Then, we want to develop a common understanding of inclusive student activities. What does that mean? What does that look like? In order to provide clarity and clarify potential misconceptions. We also want to give you some time to pause and explore resources and plan inclusive student activities for an upcoming lesson in order for you to leverage and maximize the many, many, many resources that exist. So let's start by making connections to previous learning around the math instructional guide. This session on inclusive student activities logically follows learning about guided instruction. And when we previously engaged with teachers around guided instruction, we asked them, what are some of your takeaways as you think about guided instruction? On the screen, you see 6 of them. We had hundreds to choose from, but these 6 exemplified some of your colleagues' key takeaways as they learned and thought about guided instruction. Please pause and skim through those 6 takeaways. Thank you for pausing. I just want to highlight a couple of things. One person mentioned the concrete, representational, abstract strategy. So they were excited that guided instruction is a way for us to help students make those connections. For example, if I'm learning about place value with decimals in 4th grade, I want to use place value blocks. I want to draw place value models, and I want to abstractly think about those decimals in terms of tenths and hundredths and their place value. That is the CRA strategy. Other people were excited about a lot of talk and pushing that talk and that thinking more on students, not taking away their agency, creating more open questions so they can talk. And if they can't answer something, ask something. Put that onus on them. Hopefully some of these stood out to you, but I want you to think, what is something about your own guided instruction that you've been working on? What guided instruction strategies or techniques have been impactful for your own students? Pause and think about those questions. All right, so that was a reminder about a couple of the key strategies from guided instruction, but I want us to think about the framework as a whole for a second, because guided instruction is kind of smack dab in the middle. For guided instruction, we have formative task and opening routine. I want to remind us that this funnel is not just because it looks nice. It really truly models the funnel, the flow of knowledge and ideas that we envision in the math class. Whatever you do in your opening routine, the point is to create access to the formative task. So by showing students two different fraction models and asking them what's the same and different, I'm hoping that they'll remind themselves about what fraction models look like. They might use some fraction vocabulary to talk about it. They might think, oh, wait a second, those two are equivalent. I remember that from last year. By showing simple opening routines with our kids, we're giving access to the ideas, the vocab, the strategies, the models that they might use when they get to the formative task. The formative task is intended to provide access to guided instruction. Students are solving the problems however they think about them, using what models make sense to them. They might struggle and they might not solve it, but they are thinking and doing and jogging their memory about what they do know so that you can leverage it when you get to guided instruction, at which point teacher and students are exploring the learning target. We're funneling our knowledge, we're growing our knowledge, we're providing access to the learning target. Then we get to inclusive student activities. We're going to dive into that more today because this is our opportunity for students to apply what they learned in guided instruction and to receive needed and differentiated support. Let's develop a common vision for what ISA, inclusive student activities, might look like. I want you to pause to think to yourself, what does your ISA currently look like for you, the teacher? What activities do you do? How do you spend your time? ISA is about 35 minutes long, and I'm curious what you, the teacher, are doing throughout those 35 minutes. And think about, what does ISA currently look like for your students? Again, it's 35 minutes. What are they doing for the first 10 minutes? What are they doing the next 10 minutes? How are they spending that time? What activities are they doing? 35 minutes is a lot of minutes. Pause and think about those questions. All right. Hopefully, some of the things you see on the screen are similar to things that you just reflected on. We've got some musts and some shoulds. When we think about ISA, we want to make sure that as a baseline, all students have an opportunity to address the learning target through practice. That can be independent, that could be with a partner or a group, but there's got to be some opportunity to practice the learning target. And we highlight that because we do know that there's other times when you might use ISA, for example, to do prerequisite learning on Imagine Math or other virtual program. That's okay, but you want to make sure they're doing the learning target at some point. You just learned it. We need a chance to practice and apply it. So we're doing some learning target at some point. Also, we want to make sure we're doing some small group instruction. Not every student is going to be in a small group every day. That would be impossible. But we want to make sure that you, the teacher, are pulling at least one small group each day. And of course, you're considering your students' individual needs. So bottom line, we're practicing the learning target, we're pulling at least one small group. But then we have all these opportunities for differentiation. Maybe we'll do some centers. Maybe they'll play a game or work on a project. Maybe they'll all play a game, or maybe only some will play a game today. Maybe there'll be enrichment next week, but not this week. Maybe we'll do some technology tomorrow, but not today. Maybe some of my students need opportunities to practice prior learning. As long as it's connected to the learning target, that's totally fine. What I mean by connected to the learning target is, let's say we're working on fractions with unlike denominators, adding them. Well, maybe my students don't understand the concept of an equivalent fraction. That's pretty important prerequisite knowledge. And so I can totally work on that right here. What I'm not going to want to work on is multiplying multi-digit whole numbers, because that's completely unrelated. So ISA provides a great opportunity to activate prior learning and to practice those skills that some students need extra support on that might be a grade or two below grade level. That's okay as long as it builds and connects to the learning of the day. We're trying to provide access. I'm going to want you to pause to think about what a teacher's possible 35 minutes could look like. You just thought about this for yourself, and I want to emphasize that this is not a mandate. This is just an option, a suggestion. Pause and skim through. All right, hopefully you paused and skimmed through. I want you to think about what might be the impact of a teacher circulating rather than focusing solely on SGI. So notice there was a lot of circulation happening throughout here by the teacher. What might be the impact of that? The reason we really put that in here and we asked this question is we do often find that people feel the need to spend a lot of time with their small groups. And I get it. It's a great way to provide really intensive support to a few students. But if we're circulating, we're able to catch on that, oh man, we have a misconception happening over here. I better give them a little bit of support. Or, wow, I'm so surprised they're using that strategy. I had no idea. I gain knowledge about my students. I provide them with feedback. I support them and redirect them if they're having trouble. There's so much that can be happening around the rest of the class. So we want to make sure we don't get locked into our small group. Another thing that stands out on this slide that oftentimes people have questions about is, how am I supposed to meet with one small group and circulate in just 12 minutes? Two things. One, it is our recommendation that when you're in your small group, you are focusing on a very narrow amount of knowledge. We're not trying to do 10 different problems, 5 different learning targets. What is the one small thing that you want your students to take away from this small group? And it doesn't need to take that long. You can do that in 8 minutes. The other thing is, after you do a couple of tasks together, or even just one task together, you could ask students, hey, I want you to try this problem. I'm going to go walk around and check in on your classmates. I'll be back in 3 minutes. And you can leave them in this small group to do a little work while you circulate. Here on the screen, you see what a student's 35 minutes could look like. We have 2 different options. And again, these are 2 of many options. So pause and skim through both. Hopefully you skimmed through both. I want to ask you, what is the same about what each of these students is doing, and what is different? For me, one thing I notice is the same is that at some point, both of them are practicing the learning target. Everybody wants to do some learning target practice during ISA. Both of them also have that initial opportunity to understand what's happening and that closure at the end. How are they different? Well, this student got to do an online intervention today, but this one didn't. That's totally fine. Not everybody needs to do that every day. This student got to meet with a small group and this one didn't. Again, totally fine. It's impossible to meet with every student every day. So there's some differentiation happening based on what students need. Let's think about what resources are available as we want to plan for ISA. I'm going to play a fairly short screencast that's going to walk through some of the resources that you might use as you plan ISA. Let's think about inclusive student activities planning using grade 5, unit 4, day 3. This day has the same learning target as day 2, which is represent and describe decimals and decimal fractions to the thousandths place using decimal grids, number lines, and decimal notation. So when I'm trying to plan my lesson, I've got so many resources here, but I really want to zoom in on inclusive student activities. For me, when I'm planning ISA, the first thing I like to do is just make sure that I have some simple practice problems that are aligned to the learning target. And the easiest place for me to find those is in the resource that I have in my classroom. So let's imagine I'm an Envision teacher. I'm going to go to topic 1, lesson 3. I'm going to skip ahead to the part of Envision where I have lots of practice problems. But I'm certainly not going to assign all of these problems. I'm going to pick a mix of problems that consider different aspects of rigor, really think about the learning target and what the learning target is asking, and making sure that I'm not just doing a bunch of drill and kill. So I want to consider different denominators. I might assign 11, 12, and 14. Again, different denominators. Let's do 20, 21, and 25. And then I definitely want some higher level problems that really get students thinking. So I'm going to do 29, 31, 32, and 34. Envision recommends those pink check marks. I read those problems ahead of time, and I know that this gives me a good mix of practice around my learning target. I want all students to do those problems at some point during ISA. If I'm in an expression school, I would go to Unit 2, Lesson 1, and I already skimmed through this lesson, so I'm going to jump ahead quickly to show you that I found this handout that's kind of aligned to my learning target. Again, I'm not going to assign all of it. It doesn't have as many problems as Envision, so I don't need to eliminate quite as many, but I'm going to do 6, 8, 16, and then 18 through 21. A mix of denominators, a mix of aspects of rigor, all aligned to my learning target. And I want all students to do those problems. But ISA is 35 minutes long, and my students have different needs. So in addition to doing that, I want to think about what else they could do. That's why the Pacing Guide has so many other resources. The obvious place to look could be illustrative and engage. In this case, there's nothing here for engage, but I could always look at illustrative to see if there's anything that I might want to use or assign. When I looked through this lesson earlier, I really liked some of these visuals. I think it gives a great opportunity to practice comparing and making connections between the fractions, the visual, the decimals, the visual, fractions and decimals. I actually think I might just use that for my small group instruction. So I could go back to preparation, go down to student task statement, and if I download the PDF, it will give me a nice printable version. I'm not going to use all of these pages, but I think I might just use this page. I think this would be a great way for me to work with a small group, to have them representing some of these fractions and decimals, and then discussing them, making connections between the concrete, representational, and abstract. I could even get out some place value blocks to help us as well. So I used IM in this case to help me with small group instruction. It looks like I had some other things I could have done with small group instruction, but those same resources are repeated for multiple days. So maybe I use them on day 2 or day 4, but I'm pretty good for day 3 by pulling something from illustrative. But I do want to think about, we have practice of the learning target, we have a small group activity I pulled. I want to pick at least one more thing for a center. When I looked at these earlier, I really liked mystery number. I think I'm actually going to have my students practice mystery number on day 2, 3, 4, and 5. One of the cool things about mystery number is it allows me to differentiate, because when I looked at it, I noticed that there's different versions. There's the version with whole numbers and a version with decimals. And I know that ISA is a great time for me to accelerate learning. Some of my students need practice with 4th grade place value before they can do that 5th grade place value. So we can have a center where students are playing these games with partners. It's great because they're practicing vocabulary and they have those words as a reference to help them with their vocabulary. And I can target their needs based on what version I assign them. That's probably enough for my ISA today, but if I wanted to do more, I could pick one of these other activities. Another thing I could do is if I go to my pre-assessment, it will help me understand where I can find resources from previous grades if I know I need to do even more acceleration. Another thing I can think about for ISA is exploring my tier, special education, and English learner strategies. Take a look at those documents at the beginning of the unit to really think about what strategies you can infuse throughout the unit. One thing I want to point out is actually for grades 4 and 5 in the special education document, there is something called Math by Example. And if you go down there, It's a concrete resource that you can actually print out and use. So in this lesson, I'm not adding and subtracting, I'm actually writing decimals. That's the one that's aligned to my learning target. I could use this in small group. I could have a center where students are doing this. I could assign it to some students. I could assign it to all students. But math by example is cool because it has kids analyze incorrect work and correct work. And they have those examples for all the different learning targets and standards. So although that is specifically in the special education document, it could be great for all kids during ISA. So I picked my problems from my textbook. I have my small group ready with the worksheet from IM. I'm going to have a center for mystery number, and maybe I'll have another center for math by example. That is more than enough for ISA for today. I just want to highlight that if you are in 6th grade, there's so many similarities, but there are a couple of differences just in terms of the types of resources that are aligned for additional. In 6th grade, you have a lot of things that are actually on the computer, like Desmos, or these interactive platforms. So that's something you can certainly incorporate during ISA. There's also lots of tasks. And in 6th grade, you have a really great section called Reactivating Prior Knowledge that you can use to accelerate learning. That's a lot of talking, but big picture, try not to stress too much about planning for ISA. Pick some problems from the learning target, pick something for small group instruction, and have at least one other center. That's all you really need to make sure that students are getting what they need toward the learning target and considering the different needs. Oops, we got cut off there. But hopefully you found that to be helpful. I think one of the things that really stood out to me, aside from the fact that it was my voice, was that we don't need to be overwhelmed by coming up with 18 different things. That center that I talked about, you could do that same center for 3 days in a row or 4 days in a row. Less is more. Find the best resources and really leverage them rather than trying to have a million different things going on. Let's think about inclusive student. So let's do some quick true or false questions. True or false? I should be sure to change which games and centers that I assign to students every single day. Well, I kind of just reminded you of the answer to this one a second ago. This is absolutely false. Even if you had enough time to plan that, it just wouldn't make sense. There's no way you can teach students new game rules every day. Find a game that's really impactful for that week or that topic and stick with it. True or false? Because the ELD, SPED, and MTSS documents are the same for the entire unit, it's a best practice to refer to them at the beginning of the unit to anticipate how you may infuse strategies throughout the unit. That one's true. I'm not saying only refer to it at the beginning, but definitely refer to it at the beginning, because that way you can take down some notes. Ooh, I should do this when I get to week 3. Ooh, I love this one for next week. Don't forget about those. I know a lot of times those documents are kind of ignored. They have some great stuff in them. That math by example in the special education document is an awesome thing to print out. True or false? Rather than assigning all of the problems from Envision, Expressions, or Big Ideas, it's a good idea to identify just a few that best address the learning target and all aspects of rigor. This one's true. There's definitely not time to do all the problems, but there's also not even a reason, even if you did have time. The problems start to become repetitive. Either they can do it or they can't. But definitely don't just assign all the problems at the beginning either, because those problems are usually really procedural and low level. You want to pick a really good mix. True or false? SGI tasks should only reflect the exact grade level learning target. That one's false. But it's kind of tricky because we do want to make sure that what we work on in small group is related to the learning target. It just doesn't have to be exactly aligned to it. So I gave that example earlier about equivalent fractions, helping you add and subtract fractions in 5th grade. Think about what it is that might be preventing students from accessing the learning target. Think about how you can accelerate by going 1 step back or 2 steps back. You can use SGI as a way to create access. So it doesn't have to be the exact learning target, but you want to relate it to the learning target or to tomorrow's learning target. What can I do with the small group today that will set them up to succeed tomorrow? We just want to make sure that we're not doing things that are totally out of left field. I have a colleague who made up the phrase math whiplash, where you did this whole lesson on multiplication and then boom, time for small group. We're going to talk about decimals. That just doesn't make sense. We want to create more of a cohesive experience for our students. So at this point, I would encourage you to push pause and explore all of the ISA resources for an upcoming lesson. Maybe you usually gravitate toward a certain resource. Take 5 minutes to click through and look at a resource you haven't used before, just to expand your ideas and your bank. Think about what is something new that you were excited to explore, and what one specific resource might you use and leverage for ISA for that upcoming lesson. Pause for 5 minutes. All right. I also want you to pause maybe for 5 more minutes to create a more specific plan. When you paused before, you were just exploring and looking more generally. Now I would encourage you to get more granular. For that lesson, what specifically will you do? Which problems, which center, which game, which activity? Think about what students you might assign, because I'm not necessarily going to have all of my students playing that game that day. Maybe half of them will play the game today and half of them will play the game tomorrow. Think about logistically, how will you work it out? When will they do it? How will they rotate? What do you think you'll do with your small group? And I say likely because you might change what you do and who you pull based on what you observe during the beginning of the lesson. If I'm doing guided instruction and I suddenly realize, whoa, these 4 students really need help with, like I said, equivalent fractions, I might change course. I might not have anticipated that. But we do want to have a plan coming in so that we can have something prepared. So I would encourage you to think about what you would likely do and what materials you need to prepare. That's a lot of questions. You won't get through all of them, but pause for 5 minutes to do some planning. Let's reflect and close out the session. Here's a table that a lot of people have found to be helpful because we got some questions about how are guided instruction and ISA different from each other. Ignore this color row for a second, but you'll notice guided instruction is shorter, ISA is longer. That's one simple difference. Down here, you see that when you're doing guided instruction, it's really kind of happening whole group. We're constructing knowledge together, whereas in ISA, it's a little bit more individual, a little bit more small group. In guided instruction, we're all kind of doing the same thing. We're walking through a couple of problems together. We're practicing a couple of the same problems. There's a lot more uniformity, whereas ISA is more differentiated. Even when I identify those problems from Envision, I could pick different Envision problems for different students. As long as they're aligned to the learning target, they don't have to be practicing the same Envision problems. And Teacher is primarily working with the whole class during guided instruction, whereas they're working with small groups in ISA. Let's go back to this orange row. I just want to reiterate this part about learning target alignment. Guided instruction is where we learn the learning target. So guided instruction, all about the learning target. In ISA, absolutely we're practicing the learning target, 100%. We're all doing that. However, this is also an opportunity to accelerate learning. And just to clarify this phrase, accelerate learning, it's a big term in education today. It doesn't mean enrich. I mean, you can do enrichment during ISA, but when I say accelerate learning right here, I actually mean support students with prerequisite skills. Think about what prior knowledge can I beef up that will help accelerate them toward the learning target. We don't really do that as much in guided instruction. We do a lot of it during ISA. There are lots of impactful practices for all the different components of our framework. Here are the 5 impactful practices for ISA. We didn't really talk about them today explicitly, but they're all infused into everything that we did talk about. So you might want to pause here and skim through them. In ISA, it's all about purposeful planning, small group instruction while monitoring the rest of the class and providing students with the tools and opportunities they need to practice and engage with the content. I would ask you to pause and reflect. What is one key idea, strategy, or resource that you are taking away from this session on ISA? It can be anything, but hopefully there's something key that you are taking away. As always, thank you so much for your thought and participation. If you have any questions at all, you can email math@phil.sd, but you can also target specific people if you have questions about the content, K2, 6, 8, high school. If you've got 3, 5 questions, you can direct them to me, Emily. Thanks again, and good luck.